Well, welcome here to what is this, week 3 of our quarantine. I hope everybody's doing well. This week is a really important topic, so I'm going to choose to do two lectures. First one is going to be new material. The second one will be material. I'll be going over some material. I also would like to point out that I'm going to send an email that has all of the work for this week kind of laid out for you, including directions for an assignment that I want you to do, where I'm going to ask you to kind of synthesize what we've been doing with classroom communication, complex thinking, and now planning by conducting an interview. And so I will share this with you, and hopefully you'll have the information you need to be successful here. As always, just make sure that you let me know if you have any questions and you need to reach me, okay? So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at goals and objectives, and goals and objectives are very, very important. In fact, if there's anything as a new teacher that you're going to kind of be held accountable to with a principal or a mentor teacher, it would be to be able to go over and make sure that you're able to clearly articulate your goals and your objectives, learning objectives with your students. So Grant Wiggins, who's the person that I look to, it's his planning template that I use. It's called Backwards Design. He has this really interesting quote here that I found when I was getting ready for this lecture, and it says, "Students should be presumed innocent of understanding until presumed guilty by a preponderance of evidence." And I really liked this because I think it really speaks to this idea of goals and objectives. And so before we get moving, I want you to take a minute and just for yourself, look at that quote. Think about that quote. And he's using a legal metaphor for that. But if you think about what he's really saying, and as he's really saying that as teachers, it's our job to make sure that the understanding is in fact occurring. When we were talking about complex thinking and you were looking at those videos, a lot of you were really, really focused in on how visible that learning was, how the teachers really planned to make that learning evident to the students and for the teacher. And I think that's really what Grant Wiggins is talking about. We have to make sure that we're seeing our students do understanding, that it's visible to us. There's other metaphors that you might think about and that you can think about what might work for, here's a preponderance of evidence, legal term, a trial almost. You could think of some different metaphors. I say here to be ready to share with the class because this is actually from, a template from a lecture that I gave last semester. But you understand, like, there are other ways that we could think about this idea of our job, our role is to plan so that we are able to make sure that our students understand. So one of the things that we need to understand the difference of when we are teachers is the difference between a goal and an objective. So goals, they're sort of more directional, inspirational, if you will. They are a desired outcome. And objectives are the way that we make sure that we're moving towards that goal, that we're able to measure that goal. They're observable behaviors, they're measurable behaviors. And so a goal might be that an art teacher might say the students will learn how to draw a shadow. But that's a sort of aspirational, desired outcome, right? But what are the things that the students might need to do? A, they might need to point out examples of successful and unsuccessful shadows in critiques of other people's art. B, they might be able to correctly depict form and then cast shadows in drawings of plaster, spheres, cones, and cylinders. And so these objectives take that goal and they make them more observable. How can I make sure that my students are moving towards this skill of being able to draw a shadow? Okay. Goals are general. They tend to be kind of maybe a unit long or maybe even year long. They are about what students are capable of doing after the lesson, not while you're giving the lesson. So it's kind of like, what do you want them to look like at the end of whatever the learning unit is that you're talking about? And they usually start with students will be able to analyze and interpret a text using the context in which it is written, or students will be able to judge the reasonableness of a stats as reported in a news article. So these are like things that we want my students to be able to do. The first one, after I have maybe done a historical novel with them. I would be able to, at the end of the unit, I might give them, these tend to be like what the final assessments look like. So maybe I'm asking them to analyze and interpret a text using the context in which it was written. So The Great Gatsby was a novel that I did that a lot. We talked a lot about what was happening in the 20s when The Great Gatsby was written, and then they were looking at, and their end assessment was trying to determine how this was actually a social satire, social commentary. The second one, I could be a math teacher and I can go over stats and I can go over the functions of stats and I can go over the elements of stats. But then I might give them an application because maybe I don't necessarily want them to just remember a formula. Maybe I want them to be able to apply their knowledge of stats in real life. And so maybe the end assessment is for them to go out and look at stats as they're used in, say, a newspaper and identify whether or not they think that using mathematical thinking or reasoning, whether or not those stats are appropriately used. So objectives are measurable and they contribute to the goal of the unit. So like the steps that get us to the goal, okay? So when we look at this, like here are some things. Students will be able to accurately use common irregular verbs in past tense. That's an objective. Students will be able to describe the characteristics of 10 Impressionist painters. Again, that's an objective. Students will be able to use adjectives to qualify nouns, making correct agreements. Again, that's an objective. The goals might be for the first one. The goals might be that students are able to converse fluently in a foreign language. The second one might be that students will be able to use knowledge of artistic movements to be able to judge the quality of somebody's work. The third objective for the third goal for the objective students who are making adjectives to qualify nouns, making correct agreements, might be that students will be able to use correct grammar usage to be able to convey their understandings or convey their ideas. Some schools will actually require a target level of performance. So it might say with at least 80% accuracy, students will be able to use common irregular verbs in past tense. So a Spanish class might have that. So it might say the second one, students will be able to describe the characteristics of 10 Impressionist painters. They might actually say students will be able to describe at least 3 characteristics presented in paintings of 10 Impressionist paintings. The third one, students will be able to use adjectives to qualify nouns, making correct agreements. With at least 80% accuracy, students will be able to use adjectives to qualify nouns. So that's something you should be aware of. Some schools are very, very, very specific in their target performance levels. That's my daughter's dog. Sorry about that. He's visiting. So what you want to ask yourself is, what will students accomplish in this lesson? What specific level will the students perform the given task in order for the lesson to be considered satisfactorily accomplished? And exactly how will the students show that they understand and learn the goals of your lesson? Will this occur through a worksheet, a group work, a presentation, an illustration? So you always want to think about, how am I going to be able to know whether or not we reach the goal? What are the assessments that I'm going to have? So do not list actions of the lesson as goals. Your goals are not like explain Impressionist paintings, give 3 examples. Those are like the actions that you're going to do to meet your goal. Those are not the goal itself. And I want you to think about this. How would a well-written goal and objective prepare a teacher to design a lesson? You have to think about how it's creating a roadmap. It's actually like I give you a map of the city and I show you where I want the students to end up. That's what a well-written goal and objective would be. I'm going to use the well-written goals and objectives to navigate to get to where I want to get. So I want to get to the house that it's this specific house in this specific neighborhood. The goal is my sort of end destination. I have the map. And the objectives help me to kind of route out my plan to get to that place. So we want to think about learning objectives and how they can be written. So here are some poorly written learning objectives. Students will be able to know how big a sphere is inside. Students will be able to know, this is supposed to say no, the countries in Europe. Students will be able to learn more Spanish vocabulary. Students will be able to describe the myths in Homer the Odyssey. Those have problems because they're so vague. It's going to be hard for me to determine whether or not my students are, in fact, on the route towards success to get to the specific destination. So here's a better one. Students will be able to compute the volume of a sphere. So I've got a specific skill, volume. Do they know how to compute it, and do they know how to apply that knowledge of volume to a sphere? Students will be able to name the countries of Western Europe and describe their location relative to one another. Again, it's measurable. I can see it. I know whether or not my students are accomplishing this skill. Students will be able to memorize and recall the definition of 20 Spanish vocabulary words. Again, it's measurable. And then students will be able to describe the role of mythology in the development of the plot in Homer's The Odyssey. Again, this is something that I'm able to see. It's an observable behavior, and I'm able to see whether or not the students are, in fact, reaching the goal by looking at these specific objectives. Okay? So what we want to think about is when it's appropriate for us to ask our students to be doing objectives that are high level versus when we need to keep them in the lower level. So Bloom's taxonomy is a classification. Many of you are probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. We'll look at Bloom's taxonomy 2.0 as well. But Bloom's taxonomy has been used by teachers to kind of establish where, what kind of objectives are appropriate, learning objectives are appropriate. And so there are, everything begins, you have to think about it in terms of the foundation. We need to know something, so we need knowledge before we can comprehend our learning. Then before we can apply our learning, we need to comprehend it. And before we can analyze it, we need to be able to apply it. So we need to know what's going on. Same with synthesis and evaluation. Evaluation, in the original Bloom's taxonomy chart, evaluation was like the high end. And that's why, argumentation and essay writing, that's why it's often considered, that's often used for those highest examples, those most complex learning objectives, okay? And so when you look at these, you want to think about, so I'm going back to the objectives I had earlier, and let's think about which level of Bloom's taxonomy it works. So students will be able to compute the volume of a sphere. Where do you think on Bloom's that would be? That would be application. Students would be able to name the countries of Western Europe and describe their location relative to one another. That would be knowledge. Okay, students will be able to memorize and recall students will be able to name the countries and describe their location. That would be knowledge. If you're looking at map making, you might also talk about that in terms of application, maybe, depending on how you have them go about that skill. Students will be able to memorize and recall the definition of 20 vocabulary words. That's knowledge. Now think about that. Some of your classes are going to stay very much in the knowledge, the lower level. Some of them are going to be able to move our students up. Students will be able to describe the role of mythology in the development of plot in Homer's The Odyssey. That really is an analysis. That's having them analyze what role did mythology have in the plot? How did the mythology move the plot along? So I'm taking it down and I'm breaking it down. So that's analysis, okay? Bloom's taxonomy was revised recently, probably in the last 10 years, trying to look at 21st century skills and how those 21st century skills relate to the taxonomy. And so knowledge, and what I like is it's moved it down to verbs, which I think is very useful for me. Knowledge is now remembering. Comprehension is now understanding. Application is applying. Analysis is now analyzing. Synthesis has been moved up to creating, and I think it's because, in today's world, multimodal composing and video essay making and all of those things, we understand that creativity is probably more valued in the workplace and a more important skill than it used to be, and evaluation is become evaluating. And so in the revised taxonomy, they actually have flipped evaluation and synthesis and put synthesis up on top because of the understanding that that is such a critical skill. So I'm going to show you a really quick video that looks at Bloom's taxonomy.
Bloom's taxonomy.
What do you think that means?
Flowers.
If you had to guess.
Flowers.
What type of flowers?
Roses.
Roses. Okay. Hi, I'm Miss Mack.
or Lacey on days that I remember that I actually have a first name. I'm going to give you a quick and relatively watered down overview of Bloom's taxonomy with a specific focus on the cognitive processes. My explanations may be a little elementary, but I hope that this helps you guide your thinking when you're unpacking your standards, planning objectives or learning targets, and figuring out how to differentiate in your classrooms. Bloom's taxonomy is a framework that helps teachers categorize educational objectives and increase the rigor of their questioning. It's also sometimes used as an evaluative tool for course objectives and assessments to make sure that teachers are challenging their students above the level of mere factual recall. This is actually the first image I ever saw of Bloom's when I was first learning it. It's in a pyramid shape, it has knowledge at the bottom, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, all the way to evaluation at the top. Or if you're using my pyramid, evaluate ion. The categories or levels operate in increasing degrees of difficulties. That is, the first must be mastered before the next one can occur. This is a picture of the revised version of Bloom's taxonomy. Or maybe I should say that this is a picture of my version of the revised version of Bloom's taxonomy. I've seen a few 3D examples that push teachers to develop objectives that incorporate even higher, more complex levels of thinking. But I personally like to think of Bloom's as more of a staircase. Students are climbing the staircase to the top, which is representative of either standard mastery or course completion or whatever else you want it to be. And when students have reached complete mastery, they should be able to utilize all 6 levels of thinking about your standard. Each stair could be another objective that altogether helps satisfy your overall standard. Seeing the steps actually gives my students a more tangible picture of how we're growing every day. Bloom's taxonomy is split into 6 different domains. As you go up the pyramid, or my staircase, the processes of thinking can get more specific and more challenging for students. Bloom's can be used as a spectrum of sorts that varies between lower order thinking and higher order thinking, with remembering being on the lower order and creating on the higher. So why, you ask, do we need Bloom's? Well, pretend for a moment that you're an English teacher. One of your unit standards is the following. Determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in a text, including figurative and connotative meanings. Analyze the cumulative impact of specific word choices on meaning and tone. This is actually a 9th grade standard, but let's see how my 8th graders do.
Determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in the text, including figurative and connotative meanings.
Analyze the cumulative impact on specific word choices on meaning and tone.
Do you understand what any of that means?
Determine the meaning of words and phrases.
I wanted my 8th graders to read this standard so you can see how complicated the language is for a student to understand. It's up to us, the teachers, to break down these wordy and complicated standards into small, daily or weekly objectives for our students to master. What Bloom's does is enables teachers to organize their essential questions or learning targets into scaffolded categories with the goal of increasing rigor in small, manageable steps. Objectives aligned with the remembering domain are written to determine if a student can simply recall the information that they learned. At the lowest level, knowledge is the learning and recitation of facts. Aligning your objectives within the remembering domain utilizes the most basic form of questioning to test your students' knowledge. On the remember level, students are asked questions that begin with words like list, recognize, describe, match, label, or define. In this domain, you're testing a child's ability to recall learned factual information on command. Actually, many of my physical science standards fall into this domain. Describe the states of matter, identify Newton's laws, and label the parts of an atom. Rigor on these objectives can be increased by requiring students to do more with this information than simply reproduce it on an assessment, which conveniently leads us to our next cognitive domain. The next level of Bloom's asks for students to take their ability to recall factual information to the next level, to prove their understanding by building some kind of relationship between learned facts to construct meaning. What you, the teacher, should be looking for is a child's ability to explain or demonstrate their understanding of the concepts using their own words or actions. In this level of Bloom's, students are asked questions that ask them to do things like interpret, summarize, infer, compare, explain, or classify. In the application stage, students are asked to actually use their acquired knowledge to solve problems in a different way, relying on their own instincts to make decisions. When students are tested on their ability to apply knowledge, they will be asked questions that begin with words like use, execute, implement, show, or exhibit. In this stage, teachers are trying to determine if their students can carry out a procedure by using their previously acquired knowledge about a subject. The analysis level asks students to deconstruct information into smaller pieces, allowing them to make inferences about the information that they are learning. As a teacher, you are testing a student's ability to determine how parts come together to form a whole. Analytical questions begin with words like analyze, dissect, infer, diagram, or examine. This is my favorite domain to use in my science class because my students are able to really showcase their knowledge and begin to demonstrate higher order thinking. Evaluation tests the student's ability to justify a stand or decision. Can your student appraise or critique something on the basis of specific standards or criteria? To test this, questions can begin with words like test, judge, reflect, predict, or justify. And finally, we have creation. The creation domain asks students to combine information in a whole new way to propose alternative solutions or to create a new product or new point of view. To pose these questions to students, you should begin with words like assemble, combine, create, design, invent, or develop. I hope that this video taught you a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy, and I also hope that you are able to focus on anything other than my desperate need of a manicure. But before...
All right. Okay. So what I've given you, and I will upload this to Leo, and I'll send it in the email as well, is I've given you a worksheet where you have with several different topics. So you can pick a topic that is, and honestly, if you wanted to come up with a different topic, but you don't have to do all of the topics. Pick one topic. Pick a topic that maybe is kind of adjacent to where you think you're going to be as a teacher. And I want you to have some practice. If you are friends with somebody in the class and you want to do this as a partner, and you want to submit one sheet, please, if you partner with somebody, partner virtually with them. But that's fine. You can upload and just tell me, okay, Madison and I worked on this together, so this is for both of us. That's fine with me. I'm not going to require it, but I know for some of you it may be useful to work with a buddy on this one. But what you're going to do is you're going to pick one of the topics, and then I just want you to go ahead and give me an example question of each of the Bloom's taxonomy. So what would a knowledge question for that topic look like? A comprehension, an application, an analysis, a synthesis, and an evaluation. And you'll see that there are objective verbs that you can use to help you, to guide you to create correct questions, okay? Then in addition to that, I'm going to send you with this, but it's not due until next Wednesday. I'm going to send you, one of the things I want you to do is go out and talk to a teacher about how they use their planning to get the students thinking complexly, to utilize communication in the classroom. So I will send you all of that. And hopefully within the next couple of days, you'll be able to find somebody to talk to and work through that assignment. All right, thank you so much, and we will be in touch.